Good morning.
Good morning, ma'am.
Okay. So I believe you've already received recordings and started watching them for FMP.
Ma'am, yes, I've received, but I've not started watching the recordings for this particular FMP readings.
You?
I was lagging behind on the VRM videos, so I was catching up on those. And as well as my CM1 exam, I've given them as well in April.
All right. Okay. So when do you plan on starting watching the FMP recordings?
I will cover them reading by reading once I finish today's class.
Okay, great. Because FMP में this time we are not doing 100% live because just the previous diet we did the entire syllabus, entire curriculum properly in the live sessions along with full question solving, etc. So this time the classes, as you know, are going to be probably weekly or maybe twice a week for revision purposes and just doubt clearance. Okay? So until and
Okay.
unless you all watch the videos and you all have a basic idea of the concepts, it is tough for us to move ahead with the classes. Okay? Also, when is your exam? When are you appearing?
I have not yet fixed the date because I have neither my license nor my passport, but I'm planning to give on the very first day of the exam, like 10th May.
10th May. Okay. Okay. So basically, sometime in May, you'll be appearing, correct?
Yes.
So you have some 5 months in hand. Okay. Actually, technically less than 5 months, which is fine. If you study diligently, then it's very, very, very much doable. Okay. So let's do something. Today's session, let's look at the first chapter. It's not a very tough one. So we can look at it even before you do the video. We can do a quick discussion on it. So the first one, so FMP. FMP as a subject, what is it? As a topic, FMP, which stands for Financial Markets and Products. This subject basically talks about all the different participants in the financial markets, all the different products, how are they used, when are they used, and basically what kind of variations there can be in the markets and the products. ठीक है? तो financial markets में what all is covered? We have the banking industry, we have the insurance industry, we have the capital markets. Capital markets includes equities, bonds, options, futures, forwards, swaps, all kinds of derivatives. All of this is covered under FMP. Now, this particular subject or this particular paper will have a lot of connections with your other subjects. For example, आगे जाके when we do derivatives, then a lot of topics. यहाँ पे in FMP, you will be looking at the concept, you will be understanding what is it, how it works, but all the calculations relating to it, some of them will be covered under FMP, while some of them will be covered under, let's say, VRM. Some will be covered under QA. Okay, so FMP basically forms the base where you first understand what product are you pricing or what product are you deriving the value of. Okay, so the very foundation of financial markets and products is the banking system, because any kind of financial market and product will need transacting to happen, and monetary transactions happen through banks serve as the biggest intermediary for these kinds of transactions. And in today's day and time, banks are not restricted to only facilitating these monetary transactions. They are also very much involved in providing different kinds of services. So let's see. सबसे पहले we look at the kinds of banks. Okay. The first kind are the commercial banks. First kind are the commercial banks, which are the traditional kinds of banks who take deposits and then make loans. Below commercial banks, we have two classifications. One is retail and one is wholesale. Now, kahin pe bhi, if we come across the concept of retail and wholesale, it means कि जो retail होगा, that caters to the customers directly, and by customers we mean smaller customers who buy or who transact in small quantities, and wholesale will always mean customers or other businesses who transact in larger volumes. So similarly यहाँ पे भी retail banks serve individuals and small businesses, wholesale banks serve corporate and institutional customers. Why is this distinction necessary? It is necessary क्योंकि for example a bank that is into wholesale banking services, let's say that particular bank has a big MNC client. Now that MNC client will not just use the bank for putting in money and taking out money. That MNC will require a lot of additional services from the bank. For example, they might have some advisory services. They might have a designated customer relationship manager who is going to help them manage their funds, who is going to help them decide what cards to take. Okay, so that's why these services are usually not given to to retail bankers, customers of the retail branch. Why? Because, for example, me and you today, if we go and if we open an account versus today, if let's say Pepsi goes and opens an account, our requirements will be very different, and will uh, the bank will find it economical only to provide such specialized services to Pepsi because Pepsi is giving that kind of business to the bank. The more money you keep in the bank, the more business you are giving the bank. Because what is traditional banking business model? Traditional banking business model is you take money. Just reduce the size. Just give me a moment. Huh. Traditional banking business model is we take money at let's say X%. That means ki the customers are coming and depositing the money and we are paying them X% on that amount, and using that money we lend it out at X plus Y%. So ये जो plus Y% है, this plus Y% is basically the margin which is used for paying out the other expenses of the bank and the profit. ठीक है? That is the traditional banking business model. You borrow at a low rate and lend at a high rate. The
Yes, ma'am.
other kind of banks are the investment banks. They are the banks which अभी बहुत ज़्यादा चला हुआ है, especially in the job market. Investment banks, investment IB firms as we call it, are very popular. Everyone wants to go into investment banking. But what do these investment banks do? Their main job is to help raise capital for the customers. So they basically guide you on what kind of capital should be raised, whether you should be raising debt capital, equity capital, whatever the route is, what rate should you make the issue at. They might underwrite your issuance. What is underwriting issuance? Underwriting the issuance is basically they will sort of take guarantee. Ki if your, let's say, equity is not subscribed to the point that we are saying, then the balance we will subscribe. So that's basically underwriting the issuance. any kind of mergers, any kind of acquisitions, restructurings, वहां पे we need the uh, advice or the opinions of investment bankers, because they perform calculations and they run numbers to see what would be the best route for a particular customer. Okay. Now remember that the same bank can engage in commercial as well as investment activities, but both the branches are kept isolated from each other. Both branches are kept isolated from each other, वरना conflict of interest होता है. ठीक है. Now the major risks faced by banks. Always remember, when you are talking about risks faced by any entities, you have to think on lines of mainly 5-6 major kinds of risks, and then after that you go into very very specific risks. ठीक है. Broadly कहीं पे भी there will be credit risk, there will be market risk, there will be liquidity risk, there will be operational risk. Apart from that, mainly ये 4 रहता है. So even the Basel and the solvency, all of these also look into these broad risks. So even for banks, usually we say CMO, credit risk, market risk and operational risk. Now credit risk क्या होता है? When you are giving credit to someone, what kind of risk are you taking up? You are taking up the risk that the counterparty might default, they might not repay your credit. That is credit risk. What is market risk? Market risk is any kind of risk arising from the financial markets. Now financial markets में क्या risk होगा? Prices move up and down. You might face losses in your trading activities. Let's say you bought at a higher price, but you had to sell at a lower price. Or there are a lot of fluctuations in your holdings. That is market risk. Any kind of risk arising from the market. Operational risks, any kind of risk that comes on because of day-to-day operations. For example, system failures. Any kind of people risk. All of these are covered under operational risks. Okay. Now for a bank, credit risk कहाँ से आते हैं? First source of credit risk is that the bank has advanced a loan and the loan is not repaid. Biggest credit risk for a bank. Second credit risk, any kind of derivative transaction the bank has entered into. Derivative transaction में basically we'll do derivatives in detail later. But let's say the bank sold a future. ठीक है. The bank sold a future. Sold a future का मतलब क्या है? That sometime in the future the bank will be selling a particular asset and receiving a fixed amount in return. Now यहाँ पे भी credit risk को बहुत बार you can also see as counterparty risk or default risk. ठीक है. तो वहां पे क्या होगा डेरिवेटिव में? Let's say on that date the bank is in a winning position, तो इसीलिए the counterparty does not pay the amount. जो fixed amount था, the counterparty does not pay because the counterparty will have to face a loss. So that is again counterparty risk or credit risk. Okay. Now even in loans हो सकते हैं principal default नहीं हो, maybe the interest is not paid up to the decided rate. Market risk कहाँ से आएगा? Market risk, banks के पास जो excess funds है, they will invest it in securities. Securities prices will go up and down. Market risks will come. Interest rates will change. Market risk comes. Exchange rate changes. Valuation changes. Market risk comes. Okay. Operational risks, I already mentioned कि system failure हो गया, cyber attack हो गया, people's control हो गया, people's risk हो गया. People's risk as in, let's say there is some kind of infidelity where or let's say there is some kind of embezzlement, there is some kind of clerical error कि entry में they missed a few zeros. Operation के अंदर they have legal risk, compliance risk and cyber risks. Cyber risks we know कि anything tech related, cyber risk. Legal risk, lot of laws come into play in the banking industry. So that gives rise to legal risk, where the bank may be exposed to a lot of litigation. And compliance risk is, we'll do the Basel regulations just in a few minutes. The banks have to comply to the Basel regulations as well as many other local regulations. So if the bank does not comply, then there is a risk of heavy penalties. So that is also considered an operational risk. Okay? Then we have a very small topic on economic capital versus regulatory capital. Hmm. Economic capital versus regulatory capital. First, tell me, what is capital? According to you, what is capital? And what is the importance of capital?
Whatever an entity holds to carry out the purchase of assets or to maintain their liquidity or solvency.
Okay, ठीक है, makes sense. So basically, any kind of amount that a particular entity holds is called capital, to ensure that the business is being carried on and the business is solvent. Now, different kinds of capital होते हैं. There can be equity capital, there can be debt capital. Debt, maybe there can be long term, short term. Usually, long term debt capital is considered capital. Short term debt is not taken part of capital per se. ठीक है? Now, equity capital, you can see, can be thought of as going concern capital, since it is meant to cover losses when bank continues to operate as a business. And debt capital can be thought as gone concern capital, since it is meant to cover losses only once the bank ceases to operate as a business. क्योंकि क्या होता है, any kind of loss that comes, first it is covered by the equity capital holders. That's why equity is the most risky layer of capital, and then the debt capital comes into play. ठीक है? Now, what is regulatory capital and economic capital? Regulatory capital, as the name suggests, as per regulations, what amount of capital, what is the minimum amount that the bank needs to hold in the form of capital. Why? कि कभी जाके in the future, if something hits, then the bank is able to recover. That is the regulatory capital. Economic capital क्या होता है? That is the amount which the bank believes is adequate for their riskiness. Now, of course, capital will have to be based on the level of risk taken. क्योंकि capital का point क्या है? Future में जाके when something will hit, it has to act as a cushion. So if a particular entity is very risky in nature, then they will need more capital in order to shield themselves from big losses. If it is a less risky business, then smaller capital will also do. So economic capital is the one that the bank calculates by itself. On our judgment, what amount of capital do we need to hold? And usually क्या होता है? Regulatory capital you have to maintain. Any bank has to maintain the regulatory capital because that is for compliance. Economic capital usually उससे थोड़ा ज्यादा होता है. Okay? Now we come to the Basel Committee regulations. जो regulatory capital के बारे में भी spoke, how and where does that regulatory capital come from? The Basel Committee is responsible for regulating the banking industry across the world. ठीक है? So it began its capital as capital requirements to account for loan and derivative contract defaults, which means initially when the Basel Committee came together, they focused only on credit risk. But obviously we saw bhi कि credit risk is not the only source. Market risk, operational risk, are also very big components of riskiness. So if you are deciding capital only on the basis of credit risk, then that is a wrong judgment. So later on, it evolved and added market risk and operational risk. Okay. Now, how the calculations have to be done? Standardized models have been released by the Basel Committee, and there is also an option now. After a lot of time, the Basel Committee allowed that banks can build internal models themselves, and they have to get it approved by the committee whether the model is performing calculations properly or not. Okay? 2007 to 9, basically global financial crisis, the biggest global financial crisis happened, and after that internal model का use करना, the regulations related to that became even tighter. Okay. As of now, all three risks must be computed using a standardized model. If a bank is approved by its national regulator, then only it may use an internal model for market and credit risk. Remember, especially क्योंकि MCQ है, operational purpose, no internal model. Internal model, if at all, can only be used for market and credit risks, and that also if the national regulator has approved. Okay. And how do we decide कि internal model use होगा कि नहीं? This is also very important, this 72.5% figure. What is that 72.5% figure? Basically, जो standard model है. The internal models calculate a required capital amount based on the greater of the capital computed by the internal model and 72.5% of the standardized model. इसका मतलब क्या है? If we simplify this, it basically means standardized model. अच्छा, पहले तो कोई भी बैंक internal model क्यों बनाएगा? Because they want to reduce their capital requirements. उनको लगता है कि जो standard model है, they are considering risks to be very high, because of which they are estimating a very high capital requirement. But the bank feels that we don't need to keep such high capital requirements, but because it's regulatory capital रखना होगा. So what they do is they instead build an internal model. And get it approved. और ये internal model naturally, ideally should give a lower amount than the standard model. तो ये जो lower amount होगा, that should be minimum 72.5% of the capital that was calculated through the standard model. Clear? Any doubt up till here?
No.
Okay. Now, two metrics, two ratios which the Basel Committee wants banks to calculate for liquidity requirement. Now, liquidity risk क्या होता है? Liquidity risk is also a very big risk for banks, because let's say if customers come to the bank asking for their money, and the bank has lent out all the money, and the bank is left with no money in hand to repay the customer. Because we know, so today for example, if I tell you, you have let's say 1 lakh rupees in your bank account, I ask you to pay 20,000 right now. You will go to the bank and tell them that please pay 20,000 to X person on my behalf. Now, if the bank has used your entire 1 lakh and all the customers' money for advancing loans, because that is the bank's business, if the entire amount has been used, then they will not have that 20,000 in hand to meet your demand, which is liquidity risk. That you are not being able to liquidify your holding. Okay? So for that, banks definitely, obviously, they maintain a certain ratio. They ensure that they have enough liquidity. If customers come up, ask for money, not just customers, they have expenses to pay. They have to pay rent, they have to pay salaries, they have to pay electricity. All of these expenses need to be paid. For that also, they need liquid cash in hand. Okay, so that is liquidity risk. इसके लिए the ratio which the Basel Committee has introduced is the liquidity coverage ratio, the LCR. What is the LCR? The LCR says that any bank has to maintain enough cash in hand or enough funding sources so that next 30 days the bank does not face any trouble in meeting their expenses, no matter how bad a situation is, even if a big crisis comes. Okay, in the event of minor financial stress, when there is financial stress, उस टाइम पे 30 days तक they have to sustain themselves. So they are not talking about routine 30 days. They are talking about 30 days in a financially stressed period. You have to have that much amount of cash in hand कि you are able to sustain. The other ratio is the net stable funding ratio. The net stable funding ratio basically focuses on assets versus liabilities. The amount of assets that the bank has and the amount of liabilities that the bank has. The banks cannot have too much liabilities on the basis of the assets that they are holding. Okay, so two ratios. Now, next we have deposit insurance. Tell me what is the purpose of insurance?
To cover up damages, or in this case, like deposit insurance is something for which the particular investor, like you and me, has their funds protected, so that even if the bank runs out of money, we get a certain percentage of the amount we deposited. But that
Mm-hmm.
incentivizes the bank to carry out risky measures as well. So we need to balance out the amount of insurance we provide to the bank.
That's right. Since you've done CM1, you already know what is moral hazard. Deposit insurance is a very big source of moral hazard because, as you said, banks get incentivized to take on more riskier transactions since they have insurance. So, if they lose the customer's money, they are not as worried as the insurance will pay out. Okay? So, that's deposit insurance and moral hazard. One way of mitigating the moral hazard is by making insurance premiums risk based. For example, poorly capitalized banks have been required to pay higher deposit insurance premiums than well capitalized banks. And that is how you address moral hazard. That is how you address moral hazard. That if a particular, uh, let's say, client for the insurance company is more prone, then they'll charge a higher premium to them. Okay? Then we have investment banking financing arrangements. So, investment banks, as I mentioned, will help you raise finance. Now, it can be privately or publicly. Privately, कैसे? Privately, they will catch hold of a few investors directly and ask them to invest in your business. That means that the investment bank will arrange the investors, they'll arrange meetings with the investors, and the investors will be directly investing in your business. And those particular investors will obviously have a lot of wealth because they have to be big investors. If they are, if there are very few investors, they have to be big few investors. And they'll also have a lot of investment knowledge because they are actually sitting in meetings only to invest their money. So they have to have that investment knowledge and that wealth. The other way is through a public offering. Public offering is what we are more familiar with, जैसे IPOs होते हैं. Big companies, they take out IPOs. They launch IPOs. What are IPOs? IPO stands for initial public offerings. These IPOs are also arranged by some kind of investment banking firm. वो investment banking firm is going to help you determine what price should you launch your IPO at, the number of shares that you should issue, the lot size that you should issue, all of these things are to the public, which means कि the entire public will have the option of investing in your business, and the value also will depend on the public. अब the price, two methods जिससे decide होता है public offering. The first one is an FC or firm commitment, and the other one is BE or best efforts. When you watch the class, detail में I have explained both of these. Right now I'm just discussing the gist of it. Firm commitment में क्या होता है? Firm commitment में a price X is determined. A price X is determined between the investment bank and the business. They determine the price X, and any shares that are not sold or that are not subscribed to, basically, let's say if the price is X per share and there are n number of shares, the company or the business pays the investment bank NX. Why NX? Number of shares into price per share. The company will pay this amount. For the company, this cost is now fixed. They have received, the company will not pay, the investment bank will pay the company NX amount. Meaning कि क्या हुआ यहाँ पे, the investment bank essentially has bought all the shares of the company and paid NX in exchange. तो company के लिए क्या हुआ? They have received X amount for every share sold, and now they can use this amount to carry on the business. What will happen to the investment bank? Investment bank ये सारा shares लेके they will place an IPO and try to sell the shares at a rate higher than X, because the delta, जो X के ऊपर जो amount होगा, that delta will be the investment bank's income. Okay, so that is a firm commitment. Why is it called firm commitment? Because company को तो commit कर दिया, that your per share price will be X. The other way is a best efforts. Best efforts issue में क्या होता है? That this X is not fixed. This is not fixed. So basically, whatever rate पे the public is ready to buy, depending on the kind of demand that is there, the investment bank will sell at that rate. And what they will do is, जितना shares बिका उतना ठीक है, बाकी shares का the investment bank is not committing. Okay, rather than agreeing to purchase the whole issue, which is less risky for the bank. If only part of the issue can be sold, the bank is not obligated to buy the unsold portion. As I said, there is no kind of commitment. But best efforts में company कैसे benefit करेगा? Best efforts में company will benefit because if it is actually a solid company and the public has a lot of demand, then पहले company को जो X मिल रहा था ना per share, हो सकता है the company also receives X plus Y. So the company benefits. It's basically a risk taken by the company that, okay, we don't want to lock in the price. We want to see how the public is responding, and we expect that we will make more money. And how does the investment bank earn in a best efforts transaction? They charge a fee. Best efforts mean they charge a fee. Okay. Dutch auction, I would suggest it's better explained in the video with numbers and examples. So you do through that. Conflicts of interest. Conflicts of interests क्या क्या हो सकते हैं in the banking industry? One, I already spoke about initially कि जो investment banking branch है and commercial banking branch है, they are kept isolated. And not just these two branches, there can be asset management, there can be security services, there can be different branches in one particular bank. But they are kept isolated from each other. Why? Because let's say, for example, investment banking and commercial banking है, ठीक है? Commercial banking वाला might say that there is a company X. This company X will give me a lot of business if the investment banking branch uh, sells their stocks properly. Okay, या फिर the investment banking branch can say that this company X is there who is consulting us. We want to engage in their offerings. We want to sell more of their shares, so they can ask the security services. They can ask the security services branch that please uh, push company X ka securities to your clients so that the sales increase. That is why these have to be isolated. And इसके लिए होते हैं Chinese walls. क्या होते हैं Chinese walls? They are basically internal controls to prevent information from being shared among these units. तो मतलब internally avoid करने के लिए there are Chinese walls. Got it?
Yes, ma'am.
Then we have banking book and trading book. When we say book, एक तो होता है books of accounts. ठीक है? Similarly, वहीं से समझ लो, एक book का मतलब है basically the business that you are writing. Okay? If I say they have a good book, it means that the kind of business that they are writing, they have a big book. It means they are writing large volumes of business. तो banking book and trading book क्या होते हैं? Banking book basically are those businesses or are those investments. They are those assets and liabilities that are held to maturity, which means कि they are in the books because of the banking business model. ठीक है? Which means कि फॉर एग्जाम्पल अगर लोन है तो वो लोन मैच्योरिटी तक होल्ड करेंगे बिकॉज इट इज अ बैंकिंग एक्टिविटी. आ जाइए, बिकॉज इट्स अ बैंकिंग एक्टिविटी. सिमिलरली जो एसेट्स है, लोन्स एसेट्स हो गए, जो लाइबिलिटीज है डिपॉजिट्स के फॉर्म में, दोज आर पार्ट ऑफ द बैंकिंग. ट्रेडिंग बुक क्या होंगे? ट्रेडिंग बुक होंगे जो लेट्स से एक्सेस फंड्स हम लोग इन्वेस्ट करके रखें. The excess funds that are invested, and these are usually mark to market. Mark to market matlab mark to market in the sense that daily basis पे their value changes because they can be liquidified at any given time because it's a trading book. But जो banking book है, that is why this distinction is necessary, क्योंकि trading book को how you study versus how you study a banking book. Banking book will not be changing its value every day. उसको आप एवरीडे वैल्यू नहीं करोगे, बट ट्रेडिंग बुक विल बी मार्क टू मार्केट डेली. ऑल्सो कैपिटल रिक्वायरमेंट में भी ऑफकोर्स ऐसे ही होगा. कैपिटल रिक्वायरमेंट बैंकिंग बुक पे डिसाइड होता है, ट्रेडिंग बुक पे नहीं. ठीक है? इन कैलकुलेटिंग रेगुलेटरी कैपिटल, market risk capital applied to trading book, which often result in lower capital requirements than the banking book. And banking book पे क्या होता है? Credit risk capital calculation apply होता है. क्यों? क्योंकि लेट्स से आपका बैंकिंग बुक और ट्रेडिंग बुक दोनों में सेम प्रोडक्ट भी है, बट जो बैंकिंग बुक है उसको आप मैच्योरिटी तक होल्ड कर रहे हो. अगर आप मैच्योरिटी तक होल्ड कर रहे हो, इट मीन्स कि यू आर एक्सपोजिंग योर सेल्फ टू रिस्क ऑफ डिफॉल्ट. ट्रेडिंग बुक क्या है? ट्रेडिंग बुक में वट एवर यू आर होल्डिंग विद द पर्पज टू सेल. सो व्हेन यू आर ट्राइंग टू सेल, then you are not exposed to default risk because your seller is only not decided who will default. You are exposing yourself to market risk. Market risk क्या कि प्राइस गिर जाएगा. ओके, सो दैट्स व्हाई यहाँ पे आप मार्केट रिस्क पे फोकस करोगे, यहाँ पे आप क्रेडिट रिस्क पे फोकस करोगे. क्लियर?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Lastly, we have originate to distribute model. Again, this is a टॉपिक जो मल्टीपल टाइम्स वीडियोस में डिस्कस्ड है, तो आई डोंट वांट कि अभी हम लोग इस पे बहुत ज्यादा फोकस करें. नाउ लेट्स डू समथिंग. ये जो 5 एमसीक्यूज है, लेट्स ट्राई एंड डू दीज एमसीक्यूज एंड आफ्टर दैट वील रैप अप टुडेज सेशन. Okay. First one is minimum level of capital a bank needs to maintain according to its own estimates, models, and risk assessments is described as
Economic capital.
very good. Which of the following actions is most likely intended to address the problem of moral hazard? Charge risk based premiums to deposit insurers, banks increase loans to higher risk borrowers, governments implement deposit insurance programs, and banks increase the interest rates they offer to depositors. Moral hazard
Uh,
किससे address होगा?
Charging risk-based premiums.
Correct. Okay. An investment bank is most likely to earn a trading profit from buying and selling securities if it arranges a Dutch auction, private placement,
Full commitment.
firm commitment. Correct. Purpose of a Chinese wall in banking is to
And this was conflict of interest, right?
hmm,
Uh,
prevent a bank failure from endangering other banks, prevent a bank's departments from sharing information,
yeah, this
restrict
one I think
companies.
B1.
B1. Right. Drawback, अच्छा, originate to distribute, we haven't done. ठीक है. Any doubts in this topic?
No, ma'am.
ठीक है. Okay. Now for the next class, I want you to see the classes, watch the classes along with questions and all for banking as well as insurance. Because insurance may, until and unless you watch the classes, it's slightly longer because but since you've already done CM1, you personally will not face a lot of problem in insurance. But uh, since the session is also recorded, it's important कि insurance का video you watch and then we discuss because they'll video में I've discussed probability, mortality, valuation, uh, equations, all of this in detail. ठीक है?
Okay, ma'am.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am.